Before I get started, I want to tell you that I really do admire Peter Thiel. I think he's a brilliant man. I think his book is really good. I thought it was the best business book I read in 2014. Peter's clearly an entrepreneur. He thinks entrepreneurial, and he has many provocative ideas in the book, so high recommendation for the book. That being said, I disagree. I disagree with what he says about competition and what he says about monopoly. So let me tell you why. First, we got to start with the definition of monopoly. And exclusive ownership through legal privilege, command of supply, or concerted action, exclusive possession or control, and a commodity controlled by one party. So we should keep that in the back of our minds as we move forward here. Now, here's the main problem with the way Peter uses monopoly. Monopoly is pejorative. Monopoly is what the enemies of business and capitalism accuse it of. And once they can accuse it of this, then they have the excuse they need to intervene, regulate, and control businesses. And capitalism is seen as a system that produces monopolies that requires the government to break them up and intervene. In view of the fact that business has this terrible reputation, I just think it's foolish to give the enemies of business and capitalism another weapon to use against us. So we should be very careful about the language that we use and not to throw around terms like monopoly so that the critics and the intellectuals and the enemies can say, see, Peter Thiel says that businesses like Google, businesses like Apple are monopolies because that gives them just the excuse they want and need. Instead, I think when Peter's talking about monopoly in his book, he really means what is often said in business jargon as competitive advantage. Every business needs competitive advantages. And a definition of competitive advantage: a superiority gained by an organization when it can provide the same value as its competitors but at a lower price, or can charge higher prices by providing greater value through innovation and differentiation. I think Peter confuses monopoly with having strong competitive advantages. And what he's arguing for is that for business to be successful, it needs competitive advantages. With that, I completely agree. Now, these are the characteristics he identifies in his book, or what I call the characteristics of a Thiel monopoly: proprietary technology, network effects, economies of scale, and branding. Now, economies of scale and branding are common. I mean, branding, come on, every business has a brand. It's not even necessarily a competitive advantage. Economies of scale are not that difficult to achieve these days. Network effects with proprietary technology are a little bit tricky, but those don't necessarily lead to monopoly, but they are definite, important competitive advantages that businesses strive to achieve. So what he calls creative monopolies, and he argues that they're good for society because they innovate and they create what didn't exist before, such as an iPhone. But what he's really arguing for, is what Schumpeter said, is the argument for the creative destruction, the creative destructive power of capitalism. This doesn't come from monopolies, it comes from the very dynamic nature of competition. So-called creative monopolies are usually just companies with strong competitive advantages that will be eroded over time. No competitive advantages are eternal. When I was a boy, I remember the big arguments around the dinner table in my house were about General Motors. This is a big, giant company. They have a monopoly on automobiles, and the government's got to break them up. Well, General Motors went bankrupt, and now the government does control it, but not because they were too big, but because ultimately they got complacent and lazy, which happens oftentimes when you achieve a dominant market position. Then it was IBM was the boogeyman. Oh, IBM's so big, something's got to be done about those guys. Then I listened to Microsoft, the terrible things about Bill Gates being dragged by the Department of Justice into the courtroom. Probably Bill Gates quitting business He decided it would be better to be a philanthropist and have everybody love me than to be accused of this horrible monopolist and have everybody hate him. So that was probably good for his own peace of mind, but I'd argue it was certainly he's done great things at the Gates Foundation, but what has Microsoft done since Bill Gates retired? We were much better off when Bill Gates was in there leading Microsoft. His favorite example in the book is Google. Is Google a monopoly? And the argument for it is they have about a 75% share of the search market. So it looks like they have a monopoly on search. I mean, really, do they have a monopoly? Can anybody compete against Google? Did Google have a monopoly 15 years ago? I mean, they created proprietary technology, and everyone that goes to Google, like myself, does so because I want to, because they're creating value for me, because it doesn't cost me anything to use Google. It's free, it's fast, it's effective, and it's a good thing because it's based on voluntary exchange. It's not based on coercive power of government that's keeping entrants out or forcing people to use the service. Google, 1 minute. I got 5 minutes in the rebuttal. So I would argue that Google's not a monopoly, and furthermore, monopolies don't really work very well. Here you can see what true monopolies are. They're always the monopolies are the ones that government creates. The public school system, government-controlled healthcare, nationalized oil and steel companies, and government-owned airlines. None of these are very effective. None of these work very well. So I'll just leave my slides up here, and I'll take it up in my 5-minute rebuttal.
Very good.